感谢大家出席今天的讲座。我非常高兴有这个机会，跟大家我对于印度逻辑的发展的想法，我也要趁着这个机会谢谢老师跟汤老师，再就是我要谢谢他给我安排这个讲座，我也很高兴有机会跟张教授有机会见面。最后我要说，我不好意思，我的普通话的水平不足以让我用普通话来讲课，对不起，抱歉。So I'll switch to a language I'm more comfortable in, mainly English, and we'll start the lecture. Let me just, I see I can just scroll down a bit. I want to just make sure I get, oops, so where do I pull to move the screen? Okay, great. A little higher. So I want to remember, this is, sorry, I'm used to another screen from Shanghai University where I can just draw on the board. Just wanted to so what I want to do is just go a little bit up, great. Oh, yes, I can go up, great. So I just want to go a little bit up here. There we go. This is what I want to get to. Can I just do this? No? Nope. So I just wanted to, while we didn't speak work, I just want to acknowledge the fact that this work is based on work that I've done with Professor Katsura. In Japan, he and I translated, though I regret have yet to fully published, though it's available, the Fudan University, and I'm on a translation, and that work was done with Professor Ling Zhengguo in Taiwan several years ago. So I just want to acknowledge this is work based on work with them. And what I'd like to do now is then turn to my talk. So to say a little bit about the period of time, in case you're not familiar with the period of time that I'm dealing with. So generally we can divide up the development of logic in India into three periods. The early period that runs roughly from, let's say, the 3rd century BCE. So this is late Jungle Shadai up to roughly, let's say, the Nanbei Tao. So roughly just before the beginning of the Sui dynasty. So this is roughly around 6th century Common Era. Then there's a kind of a further development in India, kind of a middle period that runs for a couple of hundred years, let's say roughly to around the 13th century, and then a more contemporary period from the 13th century. So this is roughly the Song, middle of the Song dynasty, all the way up to the Qing dynasty, that period roughly. Okay, so that's roughly the period I'm interested in, the earliest period. And I've been working on this for some time. And I have a page, I've done the article for the early Indian logic for the Stanford Encyclopedia, and that's been constantly updated as I do my work. And I'm going to present some of that material today. The main point that I want to make is I want to characterize the development of logic in India. So the talk, as I organized it, falls into three parts. I have some preliminary remarks that I want to make. These are basically background concepts that we can use, I think, profitably to look at the history of logic. And then I'd like to trace through the history of logic. Thank you very much. Great. So this is just a reminder of the periods that I have in mind. So this is the period we're interested in, the 3rd century BCE to the 6th century. It won't go down. So it's up, down, down. up and down. It's these, correct? These, this is up and down, right? Great, good. So I don't think I'm inadvertently touching that, but let me just switch to my hand notes. Maybe you could fix that again, I'm sorry. Basically, so I said there's some preliminary remarks, and the preliminary remarks will be talking about reasoning in general. So reasoning and how we think about reasoning. And then I want to talk about 5 perspectives on logic. This is important because I think this is a way to contrast the development of logic in Greece and then subsequently in Europe with the development of logic in India. So those are the preliminary comments I'll have to make. Then I'll actually start and turn towards the body of the talk. Great, thank you. The body of the talk is exactly where I want to be. So then this will be the body of the talk. I'll talk about this movement from argument by analogy to argument by deduction. And this basically takes place over this fairly long period of time. First, talk about the emergence of argumentation, and then turn to the development of a canonical. So canonical is a bit of a fancy English word. It just means standard. So a standard analogical argument, and then the shift from a standard analogical argument, canonical analogical argument, to a canonical deductive argument, and then talk about the culmination basically with Dignaga as kind of the consolidation of this development, and then I'll have some few concluding remarks. Okay, so are you gonna, great, so we'll just move to the next slide. Thanks. Right. Every place's technology is slightly different. Great. Okay, so the first point that I want to make is a distinction between inference and argument. Of course, these words have many uses, but the uses I have in mind, I'm going to stipulate now. Inference, I'm going to think about as a mental process. This is something humans do. And in that process, they take certain things to be true, and then they conclude on that basis that something else is true. And so inference is done in thought. If I take my inference and I express it, I have an argument, and these are but 2 sides of the same coin. So this distinction corresponds to a Sanskrit distinction between anumana and sadhana, which is basically the Sanskrit words that correspond to that. But the distinction, I think, is clear, and it's not culturally specific. So I'll move on to the next slide, please. All right. So the next point that I want to make, typically when people look at the history of some ideas, let's say the history of mathematics, we tend to look at texts that are actually mathematical texts. What I like to do is suggest that we need to look at these things a little bit more broadly. So I want to distinguish between, in the case of logic or reasoning on the one hand, which people do, and reflecting on reasoning on the other. So I take it all human beings reason, but not every group of people has stepped back to reflect upon the principles that underlie reasoning. So it's possible to have the first, namely the reason, without the second. And we know this because there are many civilizations, clearly people reasoned, they thought about things, but they didn't try to set down the principles. And there's some similarity here with language and grammar. So you can move on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to give you now several examples of, next slide, several examples of where we get this disparity between what we actually step back and reflect on and write down as opposed to what we do. So one example is, for example, the use of machines, the basic principles of machines, let's say weighing balances, or the equilibrium of the levers. The lever is something you use to lift, right? So this is something people across the planet have been doing for tens of thousands of years, but the first person to actually write down the principles was Archimedes. So what's the relationship between what Archimedes wrote down in his short book about the principles of the lever and what people did? Certainly people understood that if I wanted to raise something, I had to put the fulcrum in a certain position in order to make it work. So the closer it is, the longer the arm is here, the less work I have to do to put down. People understood this intuitively, obviously. because people have been using machines for millennia. But the first person to actually step back and write down the basic principles was Archimedes. Similarly, people have been measuring land for millennia, but the first person to sit down and write out the principles it wasn't Euclid. It was someone before Euclid, but Euclid's Book of Elements records that information. Language use is another example. People use a language, but few civilizations have actually tried to formulate the principles underlying the language. The Greek Dionysius of Thrax did that in the 2nd century BCE. That kind of undertaking you could argue is found in words, but also clearly in dictionaries like the Arya. And finally, perhaps most famously for scholars of India, the Panini's Ashtadhyayi is an attempt to actually write down explicitly a grammar for a language. So what I'm interested in is in arguments and the principles of distinguishing good from bad arguments. And the first person to have sat down to write down those principles in Europe was Aristotle in his Prior Analytics. So he writes out a set of principles, basically the Aristotelian syllogistic. Let's move it up a bit. Some people thought mistakenly early on that the logic that's used in Euclid's Elements is essentially Aristotle's syllogistic, but that's not true. As shown by Ian Mueller in his work on this, the logic you need in order to capture the arguments in Euclid's Elements requires first-order predicate logic. And the first person to actually write it out in that way was David Hilbert in the 19th century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th. Okay, so this is my preliminary point I want to make: logic, reasoning, and then the principles, discovering the principles that govern them. And so what we're going to see in India is a gradual movement from people arguing and having making inferences to slowly people trying to step back and formulate the principles that underlie the arguments. We'll go to the next slide. So the next point I want to make is, how do we think about reasoning in general? And I want to distinguish various kinds of perspectives. So I'm going to distinguish actually 5 perspectives altogether. And those perspectives are going to depend on what it is we take to be true. So in reasoning in general, we take certain things to be true and then conclude something else is true. And the question is, well, what are the sorts of things we take to be true? Well, one thing we could take to be true are our beliefs. So this would be the epistemic perspective. So if I have certain beliefs that are true, what other beliefs follow from those beliefs? If I express those beliefs, they then become expressions in natural language. So there's a linguistic perspective. And I can ask under what circumstances, if certain sentences are true, if some other sentence is true. And one of the interesting moves that Aristotle makes is actually to move from this perspective to that perspective. It's not all in one step, but essentially when you get to his Prior Analytics, he's essentially moved to this perspective here, looking at language. But he was quite clear that language expresses beliefs. But these are not the only perspectives. So if you go to the next slide, please. Other perspectives are the next slide. So the other perspective, there'll be 3 other perspectives I'm going to talk about. So the other is the perspective of argumentation, where you think of persuasion. So under what circumstances, if you're persuaded of certain things, should you be persuaded of something else? And so this raises the question not only of truth, but also of persuasion. Hopefully the two are related. So this is a dialectic perspective. This is more characteristic of Indian logic, the dialectic and the epistemic perspectives, not the linguistic perspective, surprisingly. Keep going. So when we turn to the linguistic perspective, what we'll find is here again, there's a further distinction we can make. I'm sorry, I left out the octave perspective. So there's still another perspective, which is also common in Indian thought as well as in Greek thought. So the octave perspective doesn't look at sentences or beliefs, but looks at how the world is actually configured. And so we can actually adopt any of these 4 perspectives. We can either look at arguments in terms of someone speaking about the world and being configured in a certain way, about the beliefs we have about how the world is configured, about the sentences which express it, and also the circumstances in which, having persuaded you that certain things hold in the world, I can persuade you that something else holds in the world. So in this way, states of affairs require other states of affairs. There's that relationship, factual relationship. And next slide, please. So the last perspective I mentioned already, but I'm going to distinguish two forms. So the linguistic perspective can be done in terms of looking at the actual form of the language. This makes sense because if I make an argument, I express it in language. If I want to talk about the form of the argument, the only way I can talk about the form of the argument is in terms of the form of the language used to express the argument. And this is definitely the insight of Aristotle. Aristotle spends a lot of time talking about, in fact, he's the first person to introduce the use of the variable into expressing generality of argument. So in that case, what you end up doing is you end up classifying linguistic forms. And if you look at the prior analytics, what Aristotle does there is simply identify a standard type of Greek sentence, or actually three kinds of sentences, and or four kinds of sentences, and then puts it into pairs, premises, and then a conclusion. This typically involves what's called Quine called semantic assent. So what you do here is you move from thinking about the world to thinking about how the language expresses something about the world. So the next slide, I'll give you an example of what I mean by semantic assent. This may seem a bit trivial, but it's actually not so trivial, and it doesn't come terribly naturally to human beings. So semantic assent occurs when one replaces statements or questions about the world with statements or questions used in sentences which are statements or questions about the world. So I could say to you, this man is Devadatta, but I could also say the man's name is Devadatta. So here I move to a statement about the world, an identity statement. To here I tell you something about a name for someone in the world. I could say man is a rational animal. I could say the word man means a rational animal. I could say the word man means the same thing as the expression rational animal. So I moved here from a fully ontic perspective to a fully, through semantic assent, a purely linguistic perspective. So similarly, I could say Devadatta is wise, or I could say the sentence Devadatta is wise is true. So it's this move here that we see in Aristotle that's crucial. It's a move that the Indian grammarians were completely aware of and exploited, but it's not a move that you see in general in early Indian logic. Okay, next slide, please. So the last point that I want to make is the last contrast. So we talked about ontic, epistemic, dialectic, and linguistic, but there's still one more approach, which is the symbolic approach. So this is very, very different from the linguistic approach, and it's basically the difference between logic up through the time of the end of the Middle Ages in Europe and what happens through the influence of Leibniz and appears with people like Boole, and then later with this standard first order predicative logic of Hilbert and others. So I want to emphasize this because even today, not closer, great.
Maybe you can sit here.
Okay. So is that better? Volume better? Can you tell? Is the volume better? Oh, test. Bad test. Try it again. What he's doing on.
Hello? 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 现在有回声吗？请问，如果听众认为有回声，可以在评论区说一下。现在可以听清楚的，对吗？好的。
Do you want me to sit down? Okay, sit down. Right. So the point I want to make, and this is something so I work also as a semanticist, and the subtlety of this point is even missed by what I think many linguists, and particularly philosophers. So there's a difference between natural language and notation. And this is the easiest way to show this is if you just think about the standard notation for the positive integers. These are called incorrectly Hindu Arabic numerals in English. They should be called Indic numerals. They are numerals that are indigenous to India, but now used across the planet. The grammar, the rules that you need to set up that notation are very, very simple. That's different from the grammar of the expressions we actually use in natural language. So if I say something like 9152, if I say that, notice I put in the measure words 1520, whatever I said. So the syntax there is different, right? The syntax is there's a number between 1 and 9. There's a measure word, a number, a measure word, a number. But if I write that down with Indic numerals, they're just 4 symbols there, right? So the grammar is actually different. And if you look at natural languages, Chinese tends to have the simplest grammar for counting numerals, but other languages like English and Sanskrit tend to be quite complicated. So I want to stress the difference between using natural language to express something and using a symbol system to express something. By analogy, when Aristotle was thinking about argumentation, he was thinking about Greek sentences. But what's happened since then is people have developed a symbolic notation for those sentences, and they have a different structure from the structure of Greek. Similarly, first-order predicate logic has a different structure from any natural language. So that's a different perspective, the perspective of using notation, okay? So these are the 5 perspectives, and the perspectives that dominated in Europe were the linguistic perspective that then moved to the notational perspective. Whereas the perspective that dominates in India is the ontic, epistemic, and dialectic perspective. Okay, next slide, please. Great. So, yeah, so this is just a further example of that. If you look at classical quantificational logic, it doesn't have a copula, the verb to be, which English has, and which modern Chinese also has. There's no distinction between verbs, adjectives, and prepositions, which are essential in natural language. There's no distinction between the subject of a sentence, the complement of a verb, and a modifier. There's no distinction between coordinators and subordinators. None of these distinctions exist. They exist in natural language. They all exist in Chinese, but none of them exist in first-order predicate logic. So if you could just give me a little bit more room at the bottom there, please. So when I'm now going to start speaking about Indian logic, I'm going to talk about things like contraposition and deduction. I'm using all these words by analogy. What I'm saying is, when I say that there's a particular argument in Sanskrit that shows contraposition, what I mean by that is, if you symbolize that argument, then you will use the principle of contraposition from logic. Okay, because contraposition is defined relative to a notation system, and it's only applied to natural language by analogy. This is no different than I use the word wind, which means air moving, but I can talk about a solar wind. It's no longer air moving. These are subatomic particles that are coming from the sun. But it's an analogy. Okay, next slide, please. So the beginning of logic in India goes back to essentially oral practices in public debates in the Shastric literature. So we know quite early on from the Buddhist and Jain canons that there was a tradition of proselytizing. Proselytizing is a fancy word that means to get someone to join your religion. So if I proselytize, I'm trying to get someone to join my religion. So Buddhists is a proselytizing religion. You're not just born a Buddhist, you have to become a Buddhist. So Buddhists and Jains had a literature, and in that literature, they were interested in proselytizing people, and they often had disputes with other religious followers, and there would be, in some very broad sense of the word, arguments, very broad sense of the word. In fact, they're not arguments as we would think of arguments today in a logical sense. They were simply rhetorical devices designed to try to persuade people to shift to a religion. In addition, there's development of what's called the Shastric literature. This is the technical literature that pertains to agriculture, architecture, astronomy, grammar, law, medicine, and politics. So this is another place where people are laying out particular facts and often reasoning about those facts. So these are two areas in which we have reasoning. Next slide, please. Where for the first time we get reasoning and closer to what we're interested in as philosophers is with three texts, early Buddhist texts. And these are the Yamaka, the questions of King Milinda, and the points of controversy. So Katabatu, Milinda Paha, and the Yamaka were couplets. I won't talk about the first one. This is the sixth of seven works of the Theravada Abhidharma. They're not well understood, and I'm not going to spend any time on it. But it does show that there's awareness of patterns, because the same patterns of sentence is given again and again. I'll say a little bit about the questions of King Milinda, and then I'll say a bit more about the Katabatu. Next slide, please. So sometimes people think the questions of King Milinda are actually filled with arguments. Well, I took the time to actually read the text in English. I didn't read it in Pali. I read it in English. 99.9% of the text has no argumentation whatsoever. They are essentially, whoops, sorry, maybe it went too far. Is it possible it went too far? Maybe not. That's fine, leave it there. And in the questions of King Milinda, most of it is a dialogue between Nagasena and the Bactrian Greek King Milinda. And basically Nagasena is teaching Milinda about Buddhism. The asks questions, and then Nagasena answers. And often what he's doing is he's expounding Buddhist doctrine using elaborate analogies. It's very rare that there's an actual argument in the text. There are arguments, but they're fairly rare. The first text where we really have arguments is the points of controversy. This is an example often cited. This is from Bohensky. The argument goes like this: so there are two people arguing, a Theravada and a Putlavada. Is the soul known truly and ultimately? The other person says yes. Is the soul known truly and ultimately just like any other ultimate fact? He says no. And the argument is that the Theravada has trapped the Putlavada in a contradiction, because he will argue if your answer to this is yes, your answer to this has to be yes as well. So now he says, acknowledge your refutation. If the soul is known truly and ultimately, then indeed, good sir, you should also say that the soul is known truly and ultimately, just like any ultimate fact. What you say here is wrong, namely, that we ought to say that the soul is known truly and ultimately, but we ought not to say that the soul is known truly and ultimately, just like any other ultimate fact. If the latter statement cannot be admitted, then indeed the former statement should not be admitted. Go down, please, a bit more. So it is wrong to affirm that the former statement A and to deny the latter statement. So the logic of this, you go to the next slide, if you abstract from this, which you can, and just pull out the form. So we're doing what Aristotle did. We go to the form of this. What we find is that we have the following schema. that characterizes not only this argument, but many other arguments. They plug into the schema. So what we have is, he asked, is A B? He says yes. Is C D? He says no. He says acknowledge your refutation. If A is B, then C is D. What you say here is wrong, namely that A is B, but C is not D. If C is not D, then A is not B. It is wrong to say that A is B and C is not D. So this is a very long-winded argument, but an oral tradition tends to be very long-winded. And if we go down to the next slide, what we'll see is what we have here is essentially the following principles of logic if we put it in symbolic logic. So there's no symbolic logic there, but we could put it in symbolic logic. And what we would have is we would have the following principles. First, the implicit principle is that it's wrong to hold inconsistent propositions. The sentences corresponding to instances of the following propositional schemata are inconsistent. You can't hold alpha, not beta, and alpha arrow beta. So of course, this notation isn't there, but that's the natural language counterpart of these principles. And finally, he takes it to be true that if alpha arrow beta, then not beta arrow not alpha, so contraposition. So these are all principles that are there. As I said, the whole text is filled with these kinds of arguments. You could abstract a single form or a few forms and characterize almost all of the arguments. So what that suggests, next slide, please. What that suggests is that people were perfectly aware of the use of form as a way of characterizing arguments. But what we don't see is the step back that we see in Aristotle to try to characterize what those forms are. So they're aware of it, but they don't turn to that. So the next step here in the evolution, as we move from, as we see the emergence of what I call a canonical analogical argument, we don't see this in Nagarjuna. If we look at Nagarjuna's text or his students, Aryadeva's text, what we find, and I've looked recently very, very carefully at this well-studied text, what we find here again are lots of arguments. Some what we would call deductive arguments, by which I mean if you translate them into a notation, it will be deductively valid, or at least if you supplied a premise or two, it will be deductively valid, but also arguments by analogy. They're very common. Next slide, please. Great. So yeah, a little bit more. So yeah, just hold it there. So these texts, all the ones that I mentioned, have objections and replies to objections. They're quite intricate. Many of the arguments are arguments by analogy. Some are deductive, usually enthymemes. So this is just a fancy Greek word meaning an argument that if you supply an extra premise will be a valid argument. So it's this in premise. And it's standardly in natural language, we argue leaving out obvious premises. And then there are many analogical arguments. So this is not done, but if you did, you could do the following. Many arguments, the analogical arguments, could be seen to have this form. You say P has S because P has H, and then you give an example, something D, which has both H and S and different from P. So this is an argument by analogy. I'll give an example in a minute. And then they have an argument by analogy through dissimilarity. So P has S because P has H, D has neither H nor S. So these are the two kinds of standard analogy arguments you see, and they're instantiated in many, many texts. And next slide, please. What happens is shortly after this period, we then see examples of arguments actually put into this form, and this form anticipates the development of the standard Indian argument that's later found in Dignaga. So where we find this is in the Chataka Samhita. This is a medical text, but inside that medical text, there's a passage, actually 3 passages on reasoning or logic. And that text actually gives an example, so that's nice. And in contrast to that is another text called the Nyaya Bhasha. This is a commentary on the Nyaya Sutra. The Nyaya Sutra lists names of parts of arguments, but it doesn't give you any examples. The commentary does. And what we'll see is that the examples in this commentary and the examples in the Charaka Samhita are very close, and they're very clearly arguments by analogy. So next slide, please. So here's the argument. So the argument is the soul is eternal because of being uncreated like space. So the idea is that space is uncreated and space is eternal. The soul shares the property of being uncreated, therefore it shares the property of being eternal. Here's the what's called the application. The Sanskrit word is yatha. There's a standard Sanskrit pattern, yatha tatha, as so. So as space is uncreated and it is eternal, so is the soul uncreated, therefore the soul is eternal. So this is an argument by analogy. I stress this use of yatha and tatha. And when it's translated into Chinese, it's usually something like ru shi or ru ci. It's like that is used. So you can see here, they're basically what you have is you have something that has two properties. You have something else. You say it has one of the properties, therefore it has the other property. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So here's an argument taken from the Nyaya Bhasha, essentially the same, saying you can see it has the same 5 parts. Sound is not eternal because of having the property of arising. A substance, such as a pot, having the property of arising is non-eternal. And likewise, tatha, sound has the property of arising. Therefore, sound is not eternal because of having the property of arising. So again, this is an argument by analogy here. Okay, slightly different. The setup here is a little bit different, but in terms of all the bits of information, it has to, you can put all the information into the same corresponding parts. Next slide, please. This is the positive version. The next one is the negative version. So this is where you have something that has 2 properties, and you say something else fails to have the first property, therefore it fails to have the second property. And this is also taken from the Nyaya Bhasha. So sound is non-eternal because of having the property of arising. A substance such as the self, not having the property of arising, is eternal. Obversely, so I'll explain this English word in a minute. It's the same word tatha, but the grammar of Sanskrit requires that I can't translate that as the same way. When you have a negative sentence, it means sort of, oh, in the opposite way. So anyway, in the opposite way, sound does not have the property of arising, therefore sound is not eternal because of having the property of arising. So this is the negative argument. Okay, so this is the form that's now going to be transformed slowly by Buddhist thinkers. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at these 2 texts. So thankfully, these Chinese texts exist. The Fangyan Xinlun only exists in Chinese. The Rushu Lun only exists in Chinese. There's no Tibetan translation, and there's no Sanskrit original. These 2 texts will actually show us this transition from an analogical argument to a deductive argument. Again, what I mean by deductive argument is, if you symbolize these arguments, they would be deductively valid. Okay, so the next slide, please. So I'll just say the Fangyan Xinlun has 4 chapters. It's a funny text. When I was working on the translation with Katsura Sensei, we had the opportunity to talk to Hattori, the Japanese scholar who's worked on Vignaga. He had also looked at this and said his conjecture, and I think he's right, that this text was probably 4 texts put together because they don't quite fit. In any event, here's the relevant passage. So in the 4th chapter of this book appears the following argument. Could just move up a little bit higher. Great, good. Appears the following argument: 我常非感觉故，空非觉识故常，一切 不跟所觉者境界是常 This is what's crucial. 一切境界是常，而我非觉，则非常乎 So this is a rhetorical question. What's crucial here is the addition, you retain the statement of analogy here, space not being perceptible by the senses is eternal, but you get this extra added line here, which gives you a universally quantified statement. And that's the first time this appears in any text that I know of. The funny thing about this is that the author of this text thinks that this is a bad argument, and then outlines 10 what are called jatis or fallacious arguments that this author, whoever that is, thinks are good arguments. But the fact is that this is a valid argument. Of course, the reason the Buddhist is rejecting the argument is because what's the conclusion? The self is eternal. So he thinks it's a bad argument, but there's no logical analysis of it. He simply rejects the argument. And the counter arguments are all fallacies. They're recognized as fallacies, but this author must have thought they were good arguments. Okay, so this text was probably in Sanskrit, translated into Chinese, and I suspect there was some problem in the transmission of the text. So now let's go to the Rusher Lun. Things change completely. It's a completely new situation. So this is just a statement of what I said before, so we can skip this slide. But so I was going to the next slide. So the previous argument is a deductively valid argument. So the author of Rusher Lun, it's been attributed, so the Sanskrit retranslation of Tarkashastra is probably incorrect. Here I'm basing myself on the work of Onomotoi, who's worked extensively on Vasubandhu. It's not clear that the author was Vasubandhu, but it seems to be a good guess. There's overlap between passages. There are sentences in the Rusher Lun, which are like the Vadavidi, which is in Tibetan. This author is very clear. This author rejects analogical arguments as indecisive. He also argues for the adoption of a form of argument which is deductive, and it's the earliest existing extant text to adopt the threefold criterion. This is Tsu Bahetu. It's not the first one to mention it, but it's the first one to adopt it. I'll explain what these are in a minute. So, next slide. So we have this argument here, 生无常，公因公生，无中间，无中间生故。譬如，瓦器因公理生，生以灭，以破灭，生以如是，and then 故生无常。So all we have here in this argument is we have the claim, the reason, an example, and then this other standard way of drawing out the analogy. So emphasize here, piru, right? As, that's it. So the author says this is not a good argument. We shouldn't adopt this kind of argument. What kind of argument will she adopt? Let's look at the next slide. So the crucial difference in the next argument is we have a universal statement in addition to the example statement. So 生无常，因公理生无间，无中间生故。若无常住，不因公理生。So this is in fact a universal statement. I'll tell you why in a minute. And then he gives the example here, right? And then he goes on. So why is this a universal statement? So it has, so in the English is as well, if a thing is eternal, then it does not arise due to an effort. So it's a fact of natural language that you can use indefinite expressions in if-then sentences to express something that's universal. So if a farmer owns a donkey, he beats it. That's the famous one famous so-called donkey sentence. So if I have a car, I drive it. So that means whenever I have a car, I drive it. I drive every car I own. So this is the move here is exactly that. So 若无常, 无常住，不因功利生. So if something is eternal, then it doesn't accordingly arise from an effort. So by the way, this argument requires contraposition, because what we're going to do is we're going to argue for the contrapositive here. So the thing to stress is this formulation here, this move to a universal statement. So let me just move on to the next slide, where the author explains, keep going. So the author then goes on to discuss this. And here's the discussion in all the Chinese and English translation. So this is where he introduces this, you can take it right up to here. So great. Okay, so this is what he says. He says, the reason you set forth is not definite because it is seen to be pervaded by both eternality and non-eternality. So 如立因不决定，常无常，变现故. Right, so this means pervaded. This is the idea of goes everywhere. This translates something probably close to vyapti, and the 不决定 means probably something like anisthita in Sanskrit, so undecided. You can go either way with it. So then he tells you what these things are. 我立因三种相. So this 相 means these are the three characteristics. The reason I give has these three characteristics. What are they? 是根本法. So the reason is a property of the subject of the argument. So 根本 is the paksha. 同类所舍, so it's included within what is similar. 异类相异, so and it's excluded from what is different. So this basically describes the relationship in which one property has an extension, which is a subset of a second property. And this makes, and he says, this is the kind of argument you should make. Okay, so this is the change. We've now moved from an analogical to a deductive argument, and I'll move towards wrapping up. Next slide, please. Great. So the next step and the next most complete set of literature we have is Dignaga. It's often thought to have been the student of Vasubandhu. What is his contribution? He explicitly recognizes that inference, the cognitive process whereby one increases one's knowledge, and argument, the device of persuasion, are but two sides of the same coin. So he has Swarthanman and Parthanman. He introduces that distinction. He further refines the form of the canonical inference, and I'll show you what he does. In the three, what is called the Triyupa Hetu, those three criteria I just gave you, he makes it more rigorous by introducing the use of the particle eva, or only. And finally, he formulates an alternative way of characterizing this pervasion relationship in terms of what's called the Hetu Chakra. So these are two alternate but equivalent formulations of the same thing. Next slide, please. So here's his canonical argument form. So sound is non-eternal because it resulting from an effort. That which, so this is how he gets universal quantification, that which the expression is yat-tat. So that which is immediately connected with an effort is observed to be non-eternal, like a pot. So what we have here is whatever is A is B, and this becomes the standard form in later Sanskrit. Yat-tat, 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 becomes standard form. He also gives the negative version of it. That which is eternal is observed to be not immediately connected with an effort like space. So this is the let's say if we formulate this as an if-then sentence, it would be if P then Q, and this is if not Q then not P. Or if A is a subset of B, then the complement of B is a subset of the complement of A. So he's clear about that, and this becomes a bit controversial. And he's also dropped the other two parts of the argument, the analogical argument, one known as the application, the other one known as the conclusion. So there were 5 steps in the original argument. He drops the last 2 as unnecessary, and he elaborates on the third one, which gives you the universal statement. And he retains the example. So he retains the example. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's been some argument about this. So many thinkers have thought that because there's the use of the example, this somehow means that the argument is supposed to be an inductive argument. There's no evidence to suggest that there's any notion of induction. This is clearly just a vestige, a leftover. How should I paraphrase vestige? So a vestige means it's something left over from an earlier period that doesn't really have much use anymore, but it's retained. There's also the use of the word drishta in the statement. So he says whatever is A is observed to be B. And people thought that, that might also indicate that this is by induction. But that's not true, because it's not whatever A is, what every observed thing A is B. It's everything which is A is observed to be B. And this word observed, if it's correct, when you translate it into English, one of its translation is like the English word observed or noticed, it's or to know, it's a factive. So if I say something like, I know it is raining, it follows that it's raining. If I say I've observed that it's raining, in the sense of dushta, it means it's a fact. So this probably doesn't have anything to do with ideas about empirical generalization, but it's simply a way of speaking. And then finally, we have this left example of he's retained the example. You might say, well, if it's a deductive argument, why wouldn't he simply dispense with the example? And I won't go into the details of that, but there's a good dialectical reason why you should keep the example. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so conclusion then, the early forms of the canonical argument are analogical. The deductive version first appears in the Fangdian Xinlun, but the argument is rejected as a bad argument. The deductive version of the canonical argument first appears in the Rushu Lun, and the arguments are shown to be superior to other forms. And in that, the person introduces this so-called Triupa Hetu, and says this is the criteria that tells us, basically it's saying these are the truth conditions for a valid argument. And finally, Dignaga adopts the deductive version, and as I said, also incorporates, gives the formulation of the argument a more concise and logically perspicuous form, and also incorporates into the definition of the threefold criteria, Eva. And that's his main contribution. So that's the transition. I think, next slide, please, which I think is I recall correctly, this should be the last slide. The suspense, this is the last slide, I hope, yes. Yeah, that's the last slide.